Netherwood was the sort of place where ancient oaks whispered village gossip to the wind, where afternoon teas were served with scones and strict propriety, where the library's shelves held more than books. They guarded the community's quiet histories. Then, on a foggy Tuesday in October, Miss Eleanor Hargreaves was found dead beside her cluttered desk. The rare volume she had been examining lay open, but its most valuable page was torn away. The local constable called it a tragic accident from overwork, but the faint scratch on the desk's smooth wood suggested a struggle. No one wished to believe poison in their peaceful hamlet. Miss Marple had arrived to visit her old friend, and like a forgotten bookmark surfacing, the truth would emerge. Chapter 1. The foggy arrival. Miss Jane Marple stepped down from the train at Netherwood Station, clutching her small suitcase and knitting bag. Thick fog wrapped the platform, carrying the damp smell of fallen leaves mixed with distant coal smoke. She pulled her woolen scarf tighter, its scratchy texture warm against her chilled neck, while her breath misted in the sharp October air. A porter shuffled forward, boots crunching gravel, and murmured a polite offer to carry her luggage. Netherwood Village appeared through the mist, stone cottages with slate roofs glistening wetly under weak morning light. Miss Marple walked the narrow lane, gloved fingers brushing rough stone walls covered in cool, mossy patches. Wind sighed through bare branches, bringing the faint, comforting aroma of pipe tobacco drifting from an open window where an old man watched the world pass. The lingering taste of bitter train tea still clung to her tongue, a small comfort against the icy bite of the morning. Mrs. Lydia Bantry welcomed her at the cottage door with a lavender-scented embrace and the warm smell of fresh baking. "Jane, dear, how lovely you've come at last," she declared in her confident upper-class tone, guiding Miss Marple into the cozy sitting room. A fire crackled brightly in the grate, sending waves of heat that chased away the frost. The armchair's worn leather yielded softly under her, smooth wood arms polished to a gentle shine. In the hall, a grandfather clock ticked steadily, its rhythm steady and familiar. They sat with steaming cups of tea, the hot liquid warming Miss Marple's hands as she tasted its sweet, milky flavor. Mrs. Bantry spoke of village matters, observing lightly, "One hesitates to trouble a guest with trifles, but the library has stirred quite a commotion of late." Furniture polish scented the air from the gleaming sideboard, mingling with coal smoke and the faint damp wool of their outdoor coats. Rain began tapping the window panes, soft at first, then insistent, while a dog barked somewhere in the distance. Mrs. Bantry explained the cause of the stir. Miss Eleanor Hargreaves, the village librarian, had lately obtained a rare 17th-century volume of local history. Its annotated family trees hinted at long-buried scandals among the better families. "The gentry are most agitated," Mrs. Bantry said, her fingers tightening briefly on the cold metal spoon. Miss Marple listened quietly, noting the small signs of worry beneath her friend's calm manner. The wind rattled the door, and the smell of damp wool grew stronger as coats dried by the hearth. A sharp knock interrupted them, knuckles rapping urgently on wood. Elsie, the young maid, burst in, face pale and hands icy as she wrung them. "Ma'am, oh, ma'am, Miss Hargreaves from the library. She's dead." Her voice cracked with shock. The room seemed to drop several degrees, the fire's cheerful crackle turning suddenly ominous. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry hurried out, footsteps echoing on cottage floorboards, then crunching across gravel. The village green buzzed with low murmurs. Locals' breaths misted in the cold. The library door creaked open on stiff hinges, revealing dim shelves heavy with a musty smell of old paper and dust. Miss Hargreaves lay slumped across her desk, mouth slightly open and chalk dry, beside the open rare book. One page had been torn away roughly, jagged edges catching the faint light. Constable Polk stood awkwardly nearby, boots scuffing the rough stone floor. "Appears a simple heart failure, ladies," he said in his plain middle-class voice, though doubt flickered in his eyes. Miss Marple knelt carefully, her fingers brushing the cold metal of a fallen pen, its smooth barrel sticky with something dark and unnoticed. The room felt frigid, No fire had been lit, and wind whistled through a cracked window, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth. She studied the book closely. Leather-bound with gold lettering, pages yellowed and textured like old parchment. The torn sections showed haste, fibers snagged on the desk's edge, pulled in panic rather than care. Such damage spoke of desperation, not accident. It recalled old Mr. Pettigrew of St. Mary Mead, whose diary was ripped in similar fashion when his nephew tried to conceal embezzlement evidence. The tear and a faint fingerprint on the spine had eventually betrayed the young man, whose smooth hands gave lie to his claim of garden labor. Here, too, the torn page surely hid something worth killing for. Whispers among the onlookers named the likely suspects. Reverend Thomas Blackwood, the vicar, spoke upper class and measured. One hesitates to speak ill of the departed, but Miss Hargreaves was most protective of that volume. Incense and pipe tobacco clung to his cassock, its rough fabric brushing the floor. Young Arthur Langley, the assistant librarian, stammered nervously. "I saw her only yesterday evening. She seemed quite well, I think." His hands shook, cold and clammy. Mrs. Victoria Eldridge, the wealthy widow and keen book collector, declared with confidence, "I made a fair offer for the book, which she refused. That is all." Lavender drifted from her fur coat, soft and luxurious. Dr. Reginald Hayes, the village physician, murmured calmly, "Heart failure, most probably. No cause for alarm." His stethoscope gleamed cold metal against his coat. Lastly, Gerald Finch, Miss Hargreaves' nephew, said bluntly in working-class tones, "Auntie weren't herself yesterday. I took her some tea, that's all." Mud clung to his boots, smelling of wet earth. As dusk gathered, Miss Marple returned to the cottage. The fire crackled warmly now, pushing back the evening chill. She sipped sweet sherry, its taste lingering on her tongue, while cooking smells, roast lamb and onions, wafted from the kitchen, mingling with coal smoke. The clock ticked on. Outside, footsteps faded into the foggy night. What secret, hidden in that missing page, had been worth a life in quiet Netherwood? Chapter 2. Whispers in the Stacks. The next morning, Miss Marple set out early, walking Netherwood's misty lanes. Gravel crunched beneath her sensible shoes, and the air carried the sharp smell of damp wool from her coat mingled with fresh rain on earth. She passed the bakery, where warm bread scent drifted out, contrasting the chill that made her fingers ache around the worn leather handle of her knitting bag. A church bell tolled slowly in the distance. Birds answered with sharp chirps. Her first call was the vicarage, a solid stone house with rough, cool walls under her gloved hand. Reverend Thomas Blackwood received her in his study. Pipe tobacco hung thick in the air, blending with the clean scent of furniture polish on the oak shelves. "Miss Marple, how good of you to visit," he said in his measured upper-class voice, indicating a chair whose smooth wooden arms had been polished many times. A small fire crackled in the grate, pushing warmth against the frosty window where breath misted on the glass. He spoke of his last meeting with Miss Hargreaves. "One hesitates to dwell on it, but we discussed the book's value to parish records that very afternoon." His fingers rested on the cold metal handle of a teacup. The tea tasted bitter when Miss Marple sipped it. Outside, wind sighed through the bare garden, carrying the faint perfume of late lavender bushes. She noticed his hands, long-fingered, not rough from labor, but faintly calloused from turning pages for decades. He insisted he had left the library well before closing time. "She was perfectly well when I departed," he declared quietly. Next, she returned to the library itself. Constable Polk had allowed brief access. Inside, the stacks smelled strongly of old leather bindings and dust. The wooden shelves groaned gently under the weight of volumes. The room felt colder than yesterday. No fire had been lit, and rain tapped steadily on the roof. Miss Marple ran her fingers along the desk's smooth surface, feeling the faint scratch near the torn book. A wall clock ticked with slow insistence. Arthur Langley, the young assistant, appeared from between the shelves. His voice trembled as he spoke. I saw her last night, miss. She sent me home early, said she wanted to work alone." The scratchy wool of his jumper carried the faint odor of coal smoke from his lodgings. His hands were cold when he offered her a chair. He kept rubbing them together nervously. He admitted Miss Hargreaves had spoken of selling the rare volume and promised him a small share. Footsteps shuffled unevenly on the bare boards as he moved away. Mrs. Eldridge greeted her with cool confidence. "I tell you plainly, Miss Marple, I desired that book for my private collection. I offered a most generous price." Her silk dress rustled softly, smooth and cool to the touch. Hot tea was served. Its sweet taste lingered pleasantly. She admitted calling at the library the evening before, but insisted she left promptly when refused. Dr. Reginald Hayes's surgery came next. The air was sharp with antiseptic and a lingering trace of his pipe tobacco. The wooden floor creaked underfoot. His stethoscope hung cold against his waistcoat. Nothing lethal, I assure you. Rain drummed harder against the window. The room felt stuffy despite the chill seeping in. Last she called at Gerald Finch's small cottage on the edge of the village. Looked right peaky, she did. I brung her a bit o' supper later. The tea he offered was weak and chalk dry on the tongue. He spoke of an argument over money. Miss Hargreaves had promised the book would eventually be his. "But I never laid a finger on her," he protested, voice rising. As Miss Marple left the cottage, the rain had eased to a drizzle. She paused on the muddy path and bent down. Someone had dropped it here, perhaps in haste. She wrapped it carefully in her handkerchief. Evening found her back at Mrs. Bantry's fireside. The torn scrap of paper lay on the small table between them, a silent accusation. Someone had carried away the missing page, and perhaps far more. Chapter 3. Shadows of Suspicion. Miss Marple took a quiet chair in the corner, her knitting needles moving steadily. Hot tea was passed round in thick cups. The liquid tasted bitter and slightly metallic on the tongue, sharpening her attention. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with slow, deliberate strokes. Constable Paul cleared his throat. "We must establish where each of you was yesterday evening between 6 and 9 o'clock. Reverend Blackwood spoke first, voice calm and upper class. "One hesitates to repeat oneself, but I visited the library shortly after 4 to discuss certain historical entries in the volume. I left by 4:30. Miss Hargreaves was in excellent spirits. His long fingers rested on the cold metal spoon. He stirred his tea absently. The rough wool of his cassock brushed the chair as he shifted. Arthur Langley followed, stammering badly. I locked up at 5:30 as usual, but she asked me to come back at 7. Said she needed help cataloging. I went. She was alive then. I swear it." His jumper's scratchy wool carried a trace of coal smoke. He kept rubbing his cold hands together. "I left again at 7:30. She was perfectly well." Mrs. Victoria Eldridge lifted her chin. "I called at 7:20. I wished once more to make an offer for the book. She refused, rather sharply, I must say. I departed within 10 minutes. Her voice was confident, almost amused. Lavender drifted from her handkerchief. The silk of her blouse felt smooth under her fingers as she adjusted it. Dr. Hayes spoke next, middle class and measured. "I looked in at about 8 o'clock to see if the sedative I prescribed was helping her nerves. She complained of palpitations. I advised rest and left by 1:15. Pipe tobacco clung faintly to his coat. His stethoscope lay cold against his chest. Gerald Finch scowled. I brung her some supper round 8:30. Shepherd's pie and a bit o' tea. She were alive when I left, grumbling about money as usual." His boots scuffed the rough stone floor. Mud still clung to the soles, smelling faintly of wet earth. Contradictions mounted quickly. Langley claimed to have seen Eldridge arrive as he was leaving. Eldridge denied seeing Langley at all. Finch said he had passed Dr. Hayes on the lane, but Hayes insisted he had already returned home. Reverend Blackwood remained silent during the crosstalk, only murmuring once, "One does wonder at so many evening visitors to a small library." Miss Marple asked gentle questions from her corner. Voices rose and fell. Gasps punctuated the silences. The interrogation stretched nearly an hour, tension thickening the air like coal smoke. After the others departed, Miss Marple returned alone to the library. The stacks smelled of old paper and dust. The wooden shelves felt cool under her fingertips. She knelt beside the desk and felt along the underside of the drawer. Her fingers found a small hidden compartment, its leather flap stiff with age. Inside lay a thin bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. The paper was crisp yet fragile, smelling faintly of old ink. The letters concerned the rare book itself. One, dated 1892, revealed that a page had been carefully forged, an illegitimate birth inserted into a prominent local family tree. The forgery, if exposed, would upset several estates and inheritances. Footsteps sounded outside. Miss Marple tucked the bundle away quickly. Rain drummed harder on the roof. The room felt colder than ever. Sitting at the desk, she lifted Miss Hargreaves' teacup. Porcelain cracked faintly at the rim. Inside, a dark staining clung stubbornly, flaking away in tiny grains when she scraped with her nail. Not ordinary tea residues, something sharper, more chemical. Cyanide left such marks when it reacted with certain glazes. She noticed the teacup, fine porcelain with a hairline crack near the handle, the inner surface bearing a faint brownish-black stain that powdered away under light pressure, characteristic of cyanide interacting with the glaze over time. Such staining never appeared from ordinary tea. It required deliberate addition and a period of reaction. It reminded her of poor Mrs. Fortescue in St. Mary Mead, whose favorite china cup showed identical discoloration after her maid Annie poisoned her morning Darjeeling. Annie had sworn it was merely limescale from hard water, but the powdering flakes and the pitting underneath told another story. She had tested the dose first in her own cup, leaving traces in the scullery sink. The real motive had been jealousy. Annie's young man had begun paying attention to the wealthy widow, so whose hand prepared this cup? And why the telltale reaction if not poison? Miss Marple sat back in the cold chair. The clock ticked on. Small things, she reflected, so often betrayed great wickedness. Greed and shame dressed themselves in respectable clothes, yet they could not hide from a patient eye. In human nature the pattern repeated. A secret guarded too fiercely, a lie repeated too often, until violence seemed the only way to keep silence. Just as in St. Mary Mead, when the church warden Miss Hartnell altered a baptismal record to claim old Mrs. Price Ridley's fortune, and later poisoned her with digitalis in the communion wine when discovery loomed, the forgery had unraveled at a village day when sunlight falling on the page revealed a different shade of ink. The pattern was always the same. Denial turning slowly to desperation, then to murder. Humanity carried this flaw quietly, like a book with one page torn out. The loss was felt, even if the reason remained hidden for years. In Netherwood, too, the torn page and the stained cup pointed toward the same unhappy truth. The wind howled louder outside. The shadows in the library seemed to lengthen. Chapter 4. Threads unraveling. The afternoon light was thin and gray when Miss Marple set out again. A light drizzle hung in the air, carrying the smell of wet stone and damp wool from passers-by. She first made her way to the vicarage garden, where lavender bushes still held a faint fragrance despite the season. The leaves felt scratchy against the hem of her coat as she walked the narrow path. Reverend Blackwood was pruning roses near the wall, secateurs clicking sharply. He straightened when he saw her, brushing soil from his hands. "Miss Marple," he said in his careful, upper-class tone, "I trust you are not unwell after yesterday's distressing business." "One cannot help but notice certain inconsistencies," she replied gently. "Your departure time from the library, for example, seems to vary depending on who recalls it." He stiffened. "One hesitates to quibble over minutes, but I assure you I was gone by 4:30. A sudden gust of wind rattled the bare branches overhead. Raindrops pattered on the gravel. He protested that he had no reason to return, yet his fingers tightened on the cold metal handles of the secateurs. Footsteps approached along the path, a gardener carrying a barrow, and the vicar turned away abruptly, ending the exchange. Miss Marple next stepped into the village bakery. Warmth and the rich smell of fresh bread enveloped her at once. The wooden counter was smooth under her gloved palm, dusted with flour. Arthur Langley stood behind it, helping the baker's wife. He had taken temporary work there since the library closed. "M.R. Langley," she said quietly, "a word if you please." His face flushed. I've told everything already, he stammered. The scratchy wool of his apron scraped against the counter as he leaned forward. I didn't take anything from Dr. Hayes's surgery. I swear it. Yet someone saw a small brown bottle in your coat pocket the day before Miss Hargreaves died. That was only ink, library ink, for labeling shelves. His voice cracked. He rubbed cold hands together. A clock on the wall ticked loudly. Outside, wind whistled past the shop window. The accusation proved a false trail when the baker's wife confirmed she had lent him the ink bottle herself. Langley's relief was visible, though his eyes remained anxious. At MRS Eldridge's manor, the drawing room felt oppressively warm after the chill outside. A good fire crackled. The scent of lavender potpourri mixed with a trace of cooking sherry drifting from the kitchen. The embroidered cushions were pleasantly scratchy under Miss Marple's fingers. MRS Eldridge received her with cool composure. Really, Miss Marple, this persistent questioning grows tiresome. Yet you were seen near the library later than you claimed, after 8:30, in fact. Absurd. I was home by then. Ask my housekeeper. Her silk dress rustled smoothly as she rose to ring for tea. The hot liquid tasted sweet, but her knuckles showed white as she gripped the cup's cold porcelain handle. She insisted Finch had been loitering suspiciously outside the library that evening, a claim quickly contradicted by the postman, who had seen Finch walking home much earlier. Another thread frayed. Dr. Hayes's surgery smelled sharply of antiseptic and the faint remnant of pipe tobacco. Metal instruments lay in orderly rows on a tray, their surfaces cold to the touch. The wooden floor creaked underfoot. The cyanide vial, Miss Marple observed, was missed from your stores some weeks ago. Precisely, he murmured. Anyone might have taken it during surgery hours. The door was rarely locked. Rain drummed steadily against the window pane. The room felt close despite the chill creeping in at the edges. He spoke of his own financial difficulties, debts quietly mentioned in the margins of the rare books family tree, but denied any visit to the library after his earlier call. A patient's heavy footsteps sounded in the waiting room, cutting the conversation short. Last she called at Gerald Finch's cottage. Coal smoke hung thick inside. The rough stone walls felt cold even close to the small fire. Finch sat hunched over a cup of weak tea that tasted chalk dry and bitter. I ain't no murderer, he said bluntly, voice rough with working-class indignation. I took her supper, yes. Left afore 9. That's God's truth. Yet your footprints were found in the soft earth behind the library, fresh prints, made after rain began. Must have been someone else's boots. He slammed his cup down. The china clinked sharply against the rough wooden table. Wind howled outside, rattling the small window. His alibi weakened further when a neighbor recalled hearing raised voices from the cottage much later. Finch arguing with himself, perhaps, or with memory. Back at MRS Bantry's fireside that evening, Miss Marple sat quietly. The flames crackled warmly. The comforting smells of roast lamb and onions drifted from the kitchen, mingling with coal smoke and the faint damp of the day's rain. Sweet sherry glowed in her glass. Its taste lingered rich on the tongue. The grandfather clock ticked steadily onward. So many small contradictions, so many frayed alibis. Each suspect had lied, or at least bent the truth in some particular. Yet the torn page, the stained teacup, the lavender-scented scrap of paper found in the mud outside Finch's door, these refused to lie. Miss Marple gazed into the fire. The threads were unraveling, one by one. Soon the whole pattern would become clear, and with it, the hand that had torn the page and poured the poison. Outside, the wind rose to a low moan, promising storm before morning. Chapter 5. The breaking storm. Late that afternoon, the rain turned heavy, and the wind rose to a low roar. Mrs. Eldridge's drawing room, usually so elegant, now felt stifling despite the open windows. The fire crackled fiercely. The air carried strong notes of furniture polish, lavender from dried sachets, and the faint metallic edge of anxiety. 5 people sat in uneasy silence around the low table. Reverend Blackwood, Arthur Langley, Dr. Hayes, Gerald Finch, and Mrs. Victoria Eldridge herself. Miss Marple stood near the hearth, small and unassuming, yet every eye turned toward her. She spoke quietly, her voice carrying over the drumming rain. The time has come to face what really happened in the library that evening. Miss Hargreaves did not die of a heart attack. She was poisoned, cyanide, almost certainly, introduced into her evening tea. A sharp intake of breath ran round the room. Langley's hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly the scratchy fabric creaked. Finch muttered something low and angry under his breath. Eldridge lifted her chin. "Preposterous," she declared in her confident upper-class tone. "You have no proof." Miss Marple continued calmly. "The proof lies in small things. The stained teacup, the torn page, the lavender-scented fragment found in the mud outside M.R. Finch's cottage, and most of all, in the handkerchief left beneath the desk." She drew from her knitting bag a fine linen square, embroidered with the initials V.E. in delicate silk. A faint brownish residue clung to one corner. When she brushed it lightly, tiny flakes drifted down like ash. This handkerchief bears traces of cyanide crystals, not merely touched in passing, but handled while the poison was being prepared. The residue flakes because it was never properly wiped away. Mrs. Eldridge went very still. That could belong to anyone. Handkerchiefs are often misplaced. Yet this one carries your initials, and the lavender scent matches the potpourri you keep in every room of this house. Reverend Blackwood leaned forward. "One hesitates to accuse, but the forgery in the book, it threatened several families, did it not? Including yours, M.R.S. Eldridge." Eldridge's lips thinned. The book contained nothing but harmless family notes. "No," Miss Marple said gently. "It contained a carefully forged entry, an illegitimate child inserted into your late husband's line, one that would have invalidated your claim to the greater part of the estate. Miss Hargreaves discovered it. She intended to make it public unless compensated. That is why so many people visited her that evening, each hoping to persuade, threaten, or buy silence." Langley stammered. "I only wanted my share," she promised. "You borrowed money from her," Miss Marple observed. "A great deal. When she refused to forgive the debt, you grew desperate. But you did not poison her." Dr. Hayes murmured. "The cyanide was mine, taken from my dispensary. I should have locked the cupboard more carefully." Finch burst out suddenly, working-class voice raw. "I took the page. I tore it out. She told me the book would be mine one day. But when I seen what was written, my name crossed out, another put in, I lost me head. I wanted proof for the lawyers. But I never put poison in her tea." The room fell quiet except for the fire's crackle and the relentless rain. Breaths came short and shallow. The air felt colder despite the blaze. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Eldridge. "You arrived last. After Langley left, after the vicar had gone home, after Dr. Hayes had checked her pulse and departed. You brought no supper, no excuse for a medical call. You came with a plan. You stirred the cyanide into her tea while she turned away to fetch the book. The dose was small, enough to mimic heart failure. Then you tore the page to destroy the evidence of the forgery. But in your haste you left the handkerchief behind." Eldridge's face remained composed, yet her fingers trembled on the cold porcelain of her untouched teacup. "You have spun a clever tale, Miss Marple, but tales are not proof. The handkerchief is proof. The absence of your footprints in the mud, unlike M.R. Finch's, is proof. The fact that only you habitually used lavender-scented linen, and only you had both motive and undisturbed opportunity, is proof." A long silence followed. Then Eldridge spoke, voice low and bitter. "She was going to ruin me. Everything my husband left, gone. I could not allow it." Langley gasped. Finch stared in stunned silence. Blackwood murmured a prayer under his breath. Hayes shook his head slowly. Miss Marple looked at the woman with something like pity. "Greed and fear are terrible counselors, M.R.S. Eldridge. They whisper that one small act will secure everything, but they never tell you the price." Outside, thunder rolled distantly. The storm was breaking in earnest now. Later, when Constable Polk had been summoned and the first formal questions begun, Miss Marple slipped away to the library once more. The stacks smelled of dust and old leather. The shelves felt cool and solid under her fingers. She sat at the desk and opened a small drawer she had noticed earlier. Inside lay a single folded note in Miss Hargreaves' neat hand. It was addressed to no one in particular. If anything happens to me, look behind the third shelf from the window. The truth is there. Miss Marple found the spot easily. A loose panel slid aside. Within lay a second copy of the incriminating page, photographed, not torn. Miss Hargreaves had been more careful than anyone realized. She sat for a long moment in the cold, silent room. The fire had gone out. Only the wind and rain kept company with her. Then Arthur Langley appeared in the doorway, face pale and streaked with rain. He had followed her. I didn't know. I never thought. His voice broke. I've lost everything anyway. My position, my good name. Miss Marple regarded him kindly. You have lost illusions, M.R. Langley. That is painful, but survivable. Truth has a way of clearing the air, even when it hurts. He nodded slowly, something in his posture shifting, less hunched, less afraid. The first small sign of healing. Outside the storm raged on, but inside the library a quiet change had begun. Chapter 6. Echoes from the past. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the air clean and sharp with the smell of wet earth and lingering coal smoke. Miss Marple walked slowly to the vicarage. Gravel crunched under her shoes. The rough stone wall felt cool and damp beneath her gloved fingers. Reverend Blackwood received her in his study once more. Pipe tobacco hung heavy in the room, blending with the scent of old books and furniture polish. A small fire crackled in the grate, sending warmth against the chill that still clung to the window panes. He looked tired, the lines deeper around his eyes. You wish to speak of the forgery, I suppose, he said quietly, upper-class voice subdued. Miss Marple nodded. The page that was torn out did not only concern M.R.S. Eldridge's family. It also touched yours, did it not? He sighed, fingers resting on the smooth wooden desk. Many years ago, before I took orders, I was young and foolish. My father had debts. A distant cousin offered to settle them if I would. Adjust a record in the family Bible. I copied the style, inserted a false baptism. Later the Bible was rebound into that rare volume of local history. I thought the secret safe forever. He paused. The clock ticked steadily in the silence. When Miss Hargreaves acquired the book and began studying it closely, she recognized my hand. She confronted me. I begged her silence for the sake of the parish, for my position. She agreed, but only if I helped her catalog the collection without pay. I visited often. That is why my name appears so frequently in the borrowing ledger. Did you return that last evening? Miss Marple asked gently. No. After our last talk, I stayed away. Fear kept me home. His voice dropped to a murmur. But shame has its own poison, Miss Marple. It eats slowly. She left him staring into the fire, the crackle of logs the only sound. At M.R.S. Eldridge's manor the atmosphere had changed. The drawing room still smelled of lavender and faint cooking from the kitchen, but the warmth felt forced. The embroidered cushions scratched pleasantly under Miss Marple's palms. The fire burned high. M.R.S. Eldridge sat very straight, silk dress smooth and cool to the touch. You have come to gloat, she said, voice confident yet brittle. I have come to understand, Miss Marple replied. The forgery threatened your entire fortune. You knew of it long before Miss Hargreaves did. Eldridge's lips thinned. My late husband told me on his deathbed. He said the child was his by a servant girl long before our marriage. The record had been altered to protect the family name. When that wretched librarian began asking questions, I offered to buy the book outright. She laughed at me. She rose, paced to the window. Raindrops still clung to the glass. Wind sighed outside. I went that evening to make one final appeal. She refused. In anger, I snatched the cyanide vial from my bag. I had taken it from Dr. Hayes's surgery weeks earlier, telling him it was for photographic developing at home. I stirred it into her tea while she turned to replace the volume on the shelf. It was quick, almost merciful. Her voice never wavered, yet her hands trembled faintly on the cold metal window latch. I tore the page to destroy the evidence. In my haste, I dropped the handkerchief. Foolish. I should have burned it. Miss Marple regarded her quietly. You might have walked away clean had you not lingered to make sure she drank. Eldridge gave a small, bitter laugh. One always lingers, does one not? To see the deed finished. Later, in Dr. Hayes's surgery, the sharp smell of antiseptic cut through the air. Metal instruments gleamed coldly on the tray. The wooden floor creaked underfoot. Hayes sat behind his desk, pipe unlit between his fingers. "The vial," he murmured. "I noticed it missing after Mrs. Eldridge's last visit. She had complained of needing developer for old family photographs. I never suspected." He looked up, eyes weary. "She borrowed my medical bag once, saying her housekeeper was ill. The cyanide was in a side pocket, easy enough to slip away." Miss Marple nodded. "And the sedative you left with Miss Hargreaves, did it mask the early symptoms?" "Possibly. Cyanide acts swiftly, but a mild sedative might dull the first signs of distress. She would have felt only dizziness, then collapse, like heart failure." The clock on the wall ticked onward. Outside, a cart rumbled past on the wet road. Hooves clopped softly. Back in the quiet of Mrs. Bantry's sitting room that evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire. The flames crackled warmly. The comforting smells of baking bread and coal smoke drifted through the house. Sweet sherry glowed in her glass. Its taste lingered rich and soothing on the tongue. The torn page, the forged entry, the borrowed poison, all threads led back to one act of concealment long ago. Secrets, she reflected, were like acid dropped on fine paper. At first only a small mark, then a spreading stain, until the whole sheet was ruined. In human nature, the pattern repeated endlessly. People buried shame deep, believing time would erase it. Yet time only deepened the mark. And when discovery threatened, fear turned ordinary folk into desperate ones. Just as in St. Mary Mead years before, when Miss Hartnell, the church warden, had altered a baptismal record to claim old Mrs. Price Ridley's fortune. Miss Hartnell had seemed the soul of piety, always first at matins, always ready with a kind word. But the forgery came to light during a village day when sunlight struck the page at just the right angle, revealing a faint difference in ink shade. Rather than confess, she poisoned Mrs. Price Ridley with digitalis slipped into the communion wine. The motive was simple greed masked as righteous inheritance. The method quiet and deniable. The pattern was the same. Denial hardening into violence, shame twisting into murder. Humanity carried this flaw like a hidden bookmark, unseen until the page was turned. In Netherwood, the same story had unfolded. A forgery from decades past. A librarian too curious, a collector too proud. The book, once a treasure, had become a weapon. The library, once a haven, now held the echo of poison. Miss Marple gazed into the flames. The past never truly stayed buried. It waited patiently, like a volume on a high shelf, until someone reached up and pulled it down. Outside, the wind had dropped. The village lay quiet under a clearing sky. Chapter 7. The gathering storm. The village hall had never felt so small. By 6:30 that evening, every chair was occupied, and still people stood along the walls, their damp coats giving off the heavy smell of wet wool and coal smoke from the journey through the lingering drizzle. The long oak table at the front had been cleared of its usual clutter of parish notices and now held only a single lamp, a teapot, and Miss Jane Marple's knitting bag. Constable Polk stood beside the door, arms folded, boots planted firmly on the rough stone floor. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with slow, inexorable certainty. Miss Marple sat at the head of the table in a straight-backed chair whose wooden arms felt smooth and cool beneath her gloved hands. Before her lay the rare book, its leather binding cracked open at the place where one page had been brutally torn away, and beside it the small bundle of letters from the hidden compartment, the lavender-scented handkerchief, the jagged scrap of paper found in the mud, and the photographed duplicate page Miss Hargreaves had prudently concealed. She had asked that everyone concerned be present: Reverend Thomas Blackwood, Arthur Langley, Dr. Reginald Hayes, Gerald Finch, and most importantly, Mrs. Victoria Eldridge. The widow sat furthest from the lamp, her fur-trimmed coat draped over the back of her chair, silk dress still immaculate despite the day's turmoil. Lavender drifted faintly from her person, mingling with the sharper scent of furniture polish that clung to the table. Miss Marple cleared her throat. The room fell quiet except for the fire crackling in the grate and the soft patter of rain against the high windows. "Thank you all for coming," she began in her gentle, precise voice. "What I have to say concerns a murder that took place in this village only a few days ago. Miss Eleanor Hargreaves did not die of natural causes. She was poisoned with cyanide, a substance introduced into her evening tea on the night of Tuesday last." A ripple of murmurs ran through the listeners standing at the back. Someone coughed nervously. The clock ticked on. "The poison," Miss Marple continued, "came from Dr. Hayes's dispensary. A vial of potassium cyanide, kept for legitimate photographic purposes, disappeared some weeks ago. Dr. Hayes has confirmed that Mrs. Eldridge borrowed his medical bag during one of her visits, claiming it was needed for a household remedy. The vial was never returned." Dr. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His stethoscope lay cold against his waistcoat. He smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and antiseptic. "I should have been more careful," he murmured. "I never imagined." Miss Marple inclined her head. "No one imagines murder in a quiet library, doctor. That is part of the tragedy." She turned her gaze to the book. "The motive lies here. This rare volume of local history contains family trees and annotations going back to the 17th century. Among them was one entry, carefully forged many years ago, that inserted an illegitimate child into the line of descent of a prominent local family. That forgery protected an inheritance. When Miss Hargreaves acquired the book and began serious study, she recognized discrepancies in the ink and handwriting. She kept her discovery to herself at first, but eventually confronted those who stood to lose most. Reverend Blackwood sat very straight, cassock rough against the chair. "One hesitates to interrupt," he said quietly, "but the forgery also touched my own family's past. I have already confessed to Miss Marple that I was the one who made the alteration, long before I took holy orders. Miss Hargreaves knew. She used that knowledge to secure my unpaid assistance in the library." A low gasp came from somewhere in the room. Blackwood continued, voice steady though strained. "I visited frequently. I argued with her, but I did not kill her. I could not." Miss Marple nodded. "You had neither the means nor, I believe, the final opportunity. Your last visit ended well before the fatal tea was poured." She lifted the handkerchief. This was found beneath the desk. Fine linen, embroidered with the initials VE. It carries traces of cyanide crystals, flakes that powder away under light pressure. Cyanide is not something one handles carelessly. The residue suggests the poison was prepared in haste, perhaps crumbled directly from the vial into the cup while the victim's back was turned. Mrs. Eldridge's face remained composed, but her fingers tightened on the edge of the table until the knuckles showed white against the cold wood. "The scent of lavender on the fabric matches the potpourri you keep in every room of your house, Mrs. Eldridge," Miss Marple went on, "and only you habitually use scented handkerchiefs of this quality." Eldridge lifted her chin. "Handkerchiefs are mislaid all the time. Anyone might have taken one from my house." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "but consider the timing. Mr. Langley left the library at 7:30, having seen you arrive. Reverend Blackwood was long gone. Dr. Hayes had called earlier to check on Miss Hargreaves' nerves and departed by 8:15. Mr. Finch brought supper at 8:30 and left shortly after. You, Mrs. Eldridge, were the last visitor. You arrived after 8:40, when the light was failing and the street almost empty. You had no innocent reason to be there so late." Langley stammered from his place near the wall. I saw her leave the library just after 9. She walked quickly. I thought nothing of it then." Miss Marple turned to him. "You had your own troubles with Miss Hargreaves, Mr. Langley. You owed her money she refused to forgive. You hoped for a share if the book were sold. When she would not yield, you grew desperate, but you did not poison her tea. Your fingerprints were on the vial, yes, but only because Mrs. Eldridge planted them there after she took it from Dr. Hayes's bag. She wished to cast suspicion elsewhere." Langley's face crumpled. "I never meant I only wanted." "I know," Miss Marple said kindly. "Desperation makes fools of us all. Gerald Finch leaned forward, boots scuffing the floor. What about me? I tore the page. I admit it. When Auntie told me the book would be mine one day, then showed me that cursed entry, my name crossed out, another put in, I saw red. I snatched it, ran out the back, but I never put nothing in her tea. I swear it on me mother's grave. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. Your footprints were in the soft earth behind the library, Mr. Finch, fresh after the rain began. But those prints were made as you fled with the page, not when you returned later with supper. The mud on your boots matched the garden soil, not the lane. You had no opportunity to lace the tea after you left the first time. Finch exhaled heavily, shoulders dropping. Thank God for that. Miss Marple lifted the photographed duplicate page. Miss Hargreaves was cautious. She kept a second copy of the incriminating entry hidden in the library. She suspected danger. That is why she wrote the note. If anything happens to me, look behind the third shelf from the window. She set the photograph down. The room was very quiet now. Only the fire crackled and the rain whispered against the glass. The means were simple, she continued. Cyanide from Dr. Hayes's dispensary. The opportunity belonged to the last person alone with Miss Hargreaves. The motive was overwhelming. The exposure of the forgery would have stripped away a fortune built on a lie. Mrs. Eldridge, you went to the library that final time not to buy the book, but to silence the one person who could ruin you. While Miss Hargreaves turned to replace the volume on the shelf, you stirred the poison into her tea. The dose was small, enough to mimic a heart attack. Then, in haste, you tore out the page. The handkerchief you used to wipe your fingers you thrust beneath the desk and forgot. Eldridge's composure cracked at last. Her voice came low and bitter. She was going to destroy everything. My husband's name, my home, my standing. I could not let her. A long silence followed. Constable Polk stepped forward. M.R.S. Victoria Eldridge, I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Eleanor Hargreaves. He moved to her side. Eldridge rose slowly, chin high, though her hands shook. The rough wool of her coat brushed against the chair as she allowed the constable to guide her toward the door. No one spoke. Footsteps echoed on the stone floor, then faded into the corridor. The room seemed to exhale. Reverend Blackwood murmured a prayer. Langley wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Dr. Hayes stared at the table, face gray. Finch sat motionless, stunned. Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag. The fire had burned low. The air felt colder now. She looked round at the faces still turned toward her. Truth is painful, she said quietly, but it is cleaner than lies. Lies fester. Truth, once spoken, allows healing to begin. Outside, the rain had eased to a soft drizzle. Lanterns bobbed along the lane as people drifted home. The storm had broken, not only in the sky, but in Netherwood itself. Miss Marple walked back to Mrs. Bantry's cottage beside her friend. Gravel crunched under their shoes. The smell of damp earth and late wood smoke hung in the air. Inside, the fire crackled welcomingly. The scent of baking scones drifted from the kitchen. Sweet sherry was poured. Its taste glowed warm on the tongue. Mrs. Bantry spoke at last. You knew all along, didn't you, Jane? Not all along, Miss Marple replied, but little by little. The handkerchief, the lavender, the timing, and the book itself. Books, you see, are honest things. They keep their secrets, but they never lie forever. She settled into the armchair. The worn leather yielded softly. The smooth wooden arms were comforting under her hands. The grandfather clock ticked steadily onward. The truth had been spoken. The gathering storm had broken at last, and in its wake, Netherwood could begin slowly to mend. Chapter 8. Ripples of Justice. The arrest happened swiftly and without drama. Constable Polk had waited until the last echoes of Miss Marple's explanation died away in the village hall. Then, with the quiet formality of a man who had never before arrested anyone of Mrs. Eldridge's standing, he stepped forward. The iron handcuffs clicked softly, cold metal against colder wrists, as he secured her hands in front of her. She did not resist. Her silk dress rustled faintly as she rose. The lavender scent that had once seemed merely elegant now hung in the air like an accusation. "I shall go quietly," she said, voice steady though thin. "There is no need for a scene." Polk murmured something about procedure. Two young constables from the neighboring station flanked her as they walked down the short corridor and out into the drizzle. Lanterns bobbed along the lane. Villagers who had lingered outside stepped back to let them pass. Footsteps crunched on wet gravel. No one spoke. The only sounds were the soft patter of rain on umbrella canvas and the distant bark of a dog startled by the unusual procession. Inside the hall, the remaining suspects sat frozen for several long moments. Reverend Blackwood was the first to move. He rose slowly, cassock brushing the rough wooden chair, and murmured a prayer so low it was almost lost beneath the crackle of the dying fire. Arthur Langley stared at his own hands as though they belonged to someone else. His jumpers still carried the faint smell of coal smoke from his lodgings. Dr. Hayes rubbed his temples, pipe unlit between his fingers, the sharp antiseptic scent of his surgery clinging to his coat. Gerald Finch remained seated, elbows on the table, head bowed. His boots left small smears of mud on the stone floor. Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag without haste. She looked round at each face in turn. "The worst is over," she said quietly. "What remains is for each of you to decide what sort of life you will build from here." Langley lifted his head. "I've lost my position. Everyone will know I owed money, that I was desperate." "Desperation is not murder," Miss Marple replied. "Honesty about your debts will serve you better than silence. The library will need a new assistant, perhaps someone who has learned the cost of secrets." He nodded slowly, the first flicker of something like hope in his eyes. Dr. Hayes spoke next, voice low. "My dispensary will be inspected. There may be questions about how the cyanide went missing. One mistake does not undo years of good work," Miss Marple observed. "You prescribed sedatives to ease suffering. The poison was taken without your knowledge. Speak plainly when asked. Truth has its own protection." Hayes exhaled. "I shall have to live with knowing I might have prevented it." "Knowing is the beginning of prevention," she said gently. Finch pushed back his chair with a scrape. I tore the page. "I ran like a thief, but I didn't kill her." "You took what you believed was yours by right," Miss Marple said. "The courts will consider intent, but the book itself, once restored, may yet bring you what she intended. Work honestly, Gerald. That is all anyone can ask." He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a single, jerky nod. Outside, the rain had eased to a fine mist. Lantern light gleamed on wet cobblestones. Miss Marple walked back to Mrs. Bantry's cottage with her friend. Their footsteps echoed softly. The air smelled of damp earth, late wood smoke, and the faint metallic tang of rain on iron railings. Inside, the fire had been banked high. The sitting room felt warm and safe. The scent of furniture polish mingled with the comforting aroma of cocoa being prepared in the kitchen. Mrs. Bantry poured sweet sherry. Its rich taste glowed on the tongue. They sat in silence for some time, listening to the clock tick and the fire settle. At the police station, the formalities continued into the small hours. Mrs. Eldridge was placed in the single cell reserved for women, a small, whitewashed room with a narrow cot and a barred window high in the wall. The rough blanket smelled faintly of carbolic soap. The stone floor struck cold even through thick stockings. She sat on the edge of the cot, back straight, hands folded in her lap. The lavender sachet she always carried had been removed with her other possessions. For the first time in years, she smelled nothing of her own choosing. Polk stood outside the bars. "You'll be taken to the county jail tomorrow morning, ma'am. The magistrate will hear the charge." She looked up. "Will there be bail?" "Not in a case of murder," he said simply. She nodded once, then turned her gaze to the small square of night sky visible through the bars. No tears came, only a profound stillness. Word spread through Netherwood with the inevitability of dawn. By breakfast time the next morning, knots of people gathered on the green, under the dripping oaks. Voices were hushed, umbrellas tilted against the continuing drizzle. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery mingled oddly with the damp wool of coats and the faint coal smoke drifting from cottage chimneys. "She always seemed so proper," murmured the baker's wife to her neighbor. "Who would have thought?" Pride, replied the other woman. Pride and money. They twist a person. At the vicarage, Reverend Blackwood prepared his sermon for Sunday. He stood at his desk, pen scratching across paper, the room heavy with pipe tobacco and old books. He wrote of forgiveness, not cheap absolution, but the hard work of facing what one has done and what one has failed to do. The words came slowly. His own confessions still weighed on him like damp stone. Arthur Langley called at the library that afternoon. The door stood ajar. The shelves smelled of dust and aged leather. He walked between the stacks, fingers trailing along smooth wooden spines. Miss Hargreaves' desk remained untouched, papers still scattered, the teacup gone, but the stain on the blotter faintly visible. He sat in her chair for the first time. The leather yielded softly. The arms felt worn and familiar. He did not cry. Instead, he began, very carefully, to sort the papers. Small acts of order in the aftermath of chaos. Dr. Hayes opened his surgery as usual. Patients came and went. Coughs, aches, a child with a grazed knee. He listened, prescribed, bandaged. The sharp antiseptic smell was comforting in its familiarity. When the last patient left, he locked the dispensary cupboard with special care. He would write to the medical board himself. Full disclosure. The truth, however painful, was better carried openly. Gerald Finch returned to the small cottage on the edge of the village. Coal smoke curled from the chimney. The rough stone walls felt colder than usual. He sat at the table where he had once drunk chalky tea with his aunt. The inheritance, the book, the cottage, a modest sum, would come to him now, once probate cleared, but the money felt heavy. He walked to the churchyard later that afternoon, stood before his aunt's fresh grave. Raindrops slid down the simple headstone. He did not speak. He simply stood until the light began to fail. Mrs. Bantry's cottage became a quiet center of reflection. Friends called. Tea was poured. Gentle questions asked and answered. The fire crackled steadily. The grandfather clock measured the hours. Miss Marple knitted by the hearth, needles clicking in their familiar rhythm. The worn leather of the armchair cradled her. The smooth wooden arms were warm from the flames. One evening Mrs. Bantry said, "It's strange, Jane. Everything looks the same. The green, the cottages, the library. Yet nothing is quite the same." Miss Marple looked up from her wool. "Communities are like old books, Lydia. A page is torn out, but the binding holds. The story continues, changed, perhaps sadder, but not ended." The following week the inquest was held in the same village hall. The coroner's voice was dry and precise. Witnesses spoke in turn. Miss Marple gave her evidence quietly, without embellishment. The verdict was murder by person or persons unknown. No, correction, by Victoria Eldridge, who had already confessed in writing. The room emptied slowly. Footsteps faded along the corridors. Afterwards, people spoke less of poison and more of ordinary things: weather, harvest, children's colds. The first real frost came. Breath misted in the mornings. The library reopened under temporary management. New curtains were hung. The desk was polished until the scratch faded to a faint memory. Arthur Langley applied for the assistant's post and was accepted. He worked carefully, respectfully, as though each book might hold its own secret sorrow. Mrs. Eldridge's trial would come in the new year. The county jail was cold, the food plain. She spent long hours staring at the barred window, remembering the feel of silk, the scent of lavender, the weight of a fortune she had killed to keep. Pride had insulated her once. Now only memory remained. Netherwood began, slowly, to heal, not by forgetting. Forgetting was impossible, but by remembering differently. The library was no longer merely a place of books. It had become a place of second chances. Finch visited often, learning the shelves, turning pages with new care. Langley catalogued with quiet diligence. Even Reverend Blackwood preached on the prodigal son, not as a fairy tale, but as a map for those who had strayed and wished to return. Miss Marple prepared to leave. Her suitcase stood ready in the hall. Her knitting needles rested in their bag. She walked one last time to the library. The door creaked open on familiar hinges. Inside, the air smelled of furniture polish and old paper. Sunlight fell through the high windows, touching the shelves with pale gold. She ran her fingers along a row of volumes, smooth leather, rough cloth, cracked spines, small textures, large stories. She left without speaking. Outside, the wind carried the scent of frost and wood smoke. Footsteps crunched on gravel. The village lay quiet under a clearing sky. Ripples spread outward from a single stone. Some broke things open. Some mended what had been broken. In Netherwood, both had happened. And so the story continued, not ended, only turned to a new page. Chapter 9. Mending Pages. The official resolution came on a crisp November morning 10 days after the arrest. Inspector Craddock arrived from the county headquarters by the early train, his overcoat still carrying the faint smell of London coal smoke and railway upholstery. He met Constable Polk at the police station, where the small front office had been hastily tidied. The rough wooden desk now held a neat stack of statements, the signed confession of Victoria Eldridge, and the coroner's preliminary report. The air inside was cold despite the small fire in the grate. Breath misted faintly as the two men spoke in low voices. Craddock read the confession without comment, turning each page with deliberate care. The paper felt crisp under his fingers, the ink black and even. When he finished, he looked up. Straightforward enough, he said in his calm, professional tone. Motive clear, means established, opportunity undisputed. The cyanide residue on the handkerchief matches the vial from Dr. Hayes's dispensary. The torn page and the hidden photograph seal it. She'll stand trial at the assizes in January. Polk nodded. She said very little since the arrest. Only asked for her solicitor and a copy of the Times each day. Craddock folded the papers. She'll have time to reflect in Holloway. Murder by poison carries its own sentence before the judge ever speaks. They walked together to the village hall, where a brief formal meeting had been arranged for the principal witnesses. Reverend Blackwood, Dr. Hayes, Arthur Langley, and Gerald Finch were already waiting. The oak table had been polished. The room smelled of fresh furniture polish, and the lingering damp wool of outdoor coats hung along the wall. A fire crackled steadily. The grandfather clock ticked with its usual measured calm. Craddock addressed them briefly. The Crown accepts the evidence as sufficient. Mrs. Eldridge has made a full statement. There will be no need for any of you to appear at the committal proceedings unless specifically summoned. The case is closed as far as the police are concerned. A collective breath seemed to leave the room. Langley's shoulders dropped. He had been sitting rigid, fingers knotted together. Finch stared at the table as though seeing it for the first time. Blackwood murmured, "One is grateful for clarity, however painful." Hayes simply nodded, the cold metal of his stethoscope glinting against his waistcoat. Miss Marple, who had been asked to attend, sat quietly in her usual corner. Her knitting needles moved in their slow, rhythmic dance. She said nothing during the brief proceedings, only listened. After Craddock departed, promising to send formal letters of thanks, the group lingered. The fire popped. Rain began tapping gently against the high windows once more. Langley spoke first, voice steadier than it had been for weeks. "I've been offered the assistant librarian post permanently. The committee met yesterday. They said the library needs someone who understands what happened here. Someone who won't forget." Finch looked up. "You'll do right by it then?" "I mean to," Langley replied. "I've started a proper catalog. Every book listed, every annotation noted. No more secrets hidden in margins." Blackwood rose. "I have tendered my resignation to the bishop. I shall retire to a small living in Dorset, somewhere quiet. The parish here deserves a fresh start without the shadow of my own past mistake." Hayes cleared his throat. "I've reported the missing vial myself to the medical council. There will be an inquiry, but I've nothing to hide now. Better to face it openly." Finch pushed back his chair with a scrape. "The solicitors say the inheritance will come through in the spring. Cottage, a bit of money, and the book itself, once it's restored. I'm thinking of keeping the book here in the library. Let people read the truth, whatever it is. No more tearing pages." Miss Marple looked round at each of them. "Small steps," she said gently, "but honest ones. That is how mending begins." The transformations unfolded gradually over the following weeks, like pages being turned in a long-neglected volume. Mrs. Victoria Eldridge, once the undisputed queen of Netherwood society, became a name spoken in lowered voices. In the county jail, she occupied a narrow cell with whitewashed walls and a single high window. The rough blanket scratched against her skin. The food was plain porridge, bread, thin stew. She refused visitors except her solicitor. Letters arrived from distant relations, polite and distant. She answered none. The lavender sachets she had once tucked into every drawer were gone. The cell smelled only of carbolic soap and damp stone. Pride still held her upright, but it was a brittle thing now, cracking a little more each day. Gerald Finch changed most visibly. The rough-edged nephew who had once stormed through the village in muddy boots began to spend his evenings at the library. He learned the shelves under Langley's quiet guidance. His hands, once clumsy with anger, grew careful as he handled fragile bindings. He took to wearing a clean collar on Sundays and greeted people with a nod instead of a grunt. Grief still shadowed him. He visited his aunt's grave every week, rain or shine, but it no longer twisted into resentment. He began to speak of Auntie Eleanor without bitterness, remembering her sharp mind and her love of old stories. The cottage, once dark and cluttered, was slowly cleared and aired. Sunlight fell on scrubbed floors for the first time in years. Arthur Langley found purpose in the routine of the library. He arrived early each morning, opened the windows to let in fresh air, dusted the high shelves with a soft cloth. The scratch on the desk had been polished away until only a faint memory remained. He kept a small notebook in which he wrote questions about provenance and binding, questions Miss Hargreaves would have approved. In the evenings he read aloud to the village children on Tuesdays. Their laughter echoed among the stacks, a sound the old room had not heard for many years. His stammer faded. His eyes grew brighter. One spring day he would marry the baker's eldest daughter, a quiet wedding in the parish church, but that was still months away. Reverend Blackwood left Netherwood on a gray December afternoon. His cases were packed into a pony trap. The vicarage stood empty behind him. He paused at the lich gate, looked back at the church tower rising against the low sky, then climbed in beside the driver. The wheels crunched away down the lane. In Dorset he would tend a small flock, preach simply, and spend long hours in his garden. The forgery that had haunted him for decades lost some of its power when spoken aloud. Confession, he discovered, was not only penance but release. Dr. Hayes continued his practice, though more soberly. He installed a stout lock on the dispensary cupboard and kept a meticulous inventory. Patients noticed the change. His manner was gentler, his listening deeper. When the medical council inquiry cleared him of negligence, he framed the letter and hung it quietly in his surgery. It was not pride, it was a reminder. He began to take long walks in the evenings, breathing the clean air, letting the wind carry away the last traces of guilt. The community itself altered in subtle ways. The library was no longer simply a place to borrow novels. It became a quiet center of memory and truth-telling. A small brass plaque was fixed to the wall beside the desk, in memory of Eleanor Hargreaves, who loved books and sought truth. Fresh flowers appeared there every week, first from Finch, then from others. The village green saw fewer whispers and more open conversation. People greeted each other with greater care, as though aware that every life held hidden pages. Loose ends were tied with the same patient thoroughness Miss Marple had shown from the beginning. The red herrings, Langley's ink bottle mistaken for poison, Finch's muddy footprints, Blackwood's frequent visits were explained in the final police report as innocent coincidences magnified by fear. The photographed duplicate page was placed in the book by a careful bookbinder. The torn section was repaired with fine Japanese tissue so skillfully that only close inspection revealed the joint. The volume was rebound in new leather, gold-tooled, and returned to its place on the special shelf. It would never again be a weapon. It had become a witness. Miss Marple prepared to leave Netherwood. Her suitcase stood packed in Mrs. Bantry's hall. Her knitting needles rested in their familiar bag. She walked one last time along the lane to the library. The door creaked open. Inside, the air smelled of furniture polish, old paper, and a faint trace of wood smoke from the small stove Langley kept burning on cold days. Sunlight slanted through the high windows, touching the shelves with pale gold. She ran her fingers along a row of volumes: smooth calf, rough cloth, cracked spines, small textures, large stories. Langley looked up from the desk. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect. I only came to say goodbye," she said, "and to see that all is well." He smiled, small but genuine. "It will be. In time." She nodded. "In time. That is all any of us are given." Outside, frost sparkled on the grass. Breath misted in the sharp air. She walked back to the cottage, footsteps crunching softly. Mrs. Bantry waited at the door with tea already poured, hot, sweet, comforting. They sat by the fire. The grandfather clock ticked onward. "You've left them stronger than you found them, Jane," Mrs. Bantry observed. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "They were always strong. They only needed reminding." The next morning she boarded the train at Netherwood Station. The platform smelled of coal smoke and wet leaves. The whistle sounded. Wheels began to turn. She settled into her corner seat, knitting needles clicking, and watched the familiar countryside slide past. Stone walls, bare trees, distant spires. Netherwood lay behind her now, mending its pages one by one. And ahead, in St. Mary Mead, ordinary life waited, unchanged, yet always ready for the next quiet mystery. Chapter 10. Return to St. Mary Mead. The train from Netherwood reached St. Mary Mead just as the short winter afternoon began to darken. Miss Jane Marple stepped onto the familiar platform, suitcase in one hand, knitting bag in the other. The air smelled of coal smoke, wet leaves, and the faint, comforting aroma of wood fires already burning in cottage hearths. Frost sparkled on the iron railings. Her breath misted in small white clouds. The porter touched his cap and took her luggage with a cheerful, "Welcome home, miss," his boots crunching on the thin gravel. The walk to her cottage was short and unhurried. She passed the same stone walls she had known for decades, their rough surfaces cool under her gloved fingers. The village green lay quiet under the first stars. A dog barked once in the distance. Inside her own small sitting room, everything waited exactly as she had left it. The fire laid ready, the kettle polished, the armchair's worn leather cushions still bearing the faint imprint of her usual place. She lit the lamp, touched a match to the kindling, and soon the flames crackled warmly, pushing back the evening chill. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked with its steady, familiar rhythm. Tea was soon brewing, strong, sweet, milky, the taste rich and soothing after the long journey. She sat by the hearth, knitting needles clicking softly, and let the quiet of home settle around her like an old shawl. Letters arrived over the next few days, each one carrying news from Netherwood. Gerald Finch wrote first, in a careful, newly practiced hand. The inheritance had come through without difficulty. He had kept the cottage, sold a small parcel of land to pay the taxes, and placed the restored rare book permanently in the library under a glass case with a brass plaque. In memory of Eleanor Hargreaves, who taught us the value of truth, he had taken the assistant librarian post himself. Langley had moved on to a larger county library and spent his evenings learning binding and repair. "I'm not the man I was," he wrote plainly, "but I'm trying to be better." "Thank you, miss." Arthur Langley's letter came next, typed on the library's ancient Remington. He had married the baker's daughter in a quiet spring ceremony. The library now opened on Saturday mornings for children's story hours. He read aloud from the very books Miss Hargreaves had once guarded so jealously. "The shelves feel lighter somehow," he wrote, "not because anything is missing, but because the shadows are gone." Reverend Blackwood sent a short note from his new parish in Dorset. He tended a small garden, preached to a handful of elderly parishioners, and found the silence healing. "I sleep better," he confessed in his precise upper-class script. "The past no longer wakes me at 3 in the morning." Dr. Hayes unclosed a newspaper cutting. The medical council had cleared him of any negligence, accepting his full voluntary disclosure. He had installed a double-lock cabinet and begun teaching first aid classes at the village hall. "One small good from a great wrong," he wrote, Mrs. Victoria Eldridge's fate was reported more formally through the columns of the county paper. She had been sentenced to life imprisonment at the assizes, with recommendation for mercy on account of her age and previous good character. She had stood in the dock without emotion, chin high, and spoken only once. "I did what I believed necessary." The prison authorities later said she kept to herself, read a great deal, and requested no visitors. Miss Marple folded the last letter and placed it with the others in the small rosewood box on the mantel. She sat back in her chair, the fire's warmth on her face, and let her thoughts drift. The lost book had been the key, of course. Not merely a volume of local history, but a symbol, a container of hidden truths, fragile pages that could be torn but never wholly destroyed. When the forgery was exposed and the page mended, the book itself transformed. Once a weapon of concealment, it became a quiet monument to honesty. In Netherwood, the library had changed too, from a hushed repository of secrets into a living place of memory and second chances. The community, once blind to the poison beneath its polite surface, had been shocked awake, and then, slowly, had begun to understand itself better. She thought of St. Mary Mead's own parallel case, many years ago, when old Mr. Enderby's ledger had vanished from his bank office. The ledger was a plain thing, leather-bound, ruled columns, entries in careful copperplate, but it contained the record of small loans and quiet favors that kept the village turning. One night it disappeared. Mr. Enderby, already frail, died suddenly soon after. Everyone called it apoplexy, but the missing ledger troubled people. Whispers grew. Young Tom Clements, the clerk, had seemed the soul of honesty, polite, punctual, always ready with a smile. Yet he had been the last person seen with the book. When suspicion finally fell on him, he confessed, not to murder at first, but to theft. He had taken the ledger to hide his own gambling debts. He had borrowed from the bank's funds to cover them. In panic, he had poisoned Mr. Enderby with strychnine slipped into his evening brandy, believing the death would be put down to natural causes and the ledger's absence would never be noticed. The clues had been small, a torn page found in the garden, smelling faintly of ink and garden soil, a glove left behind with unusual wear on the thumb and forefinger from turning ledger pages hour after hour, a faint pitting on the brandy glass where the poison had reacted with the crystal. Miss Marple had noticed the glove first, its distinctive wear pattern, not from manual labor, but from the constant grip of a pen and the turning of heavy pages. It reminded her then of old Dr. Haling's surgical gloves, worn smooth in exactly the same places from holding scalpels. The pattern had cleared the doctor of suspicion in an earlier case and pointed directly to Tom, whose hands were smooth and ink-stained despite his claim of having been digging in the garden all evening. The parallel was clear. In both villages, a hidden document had become the fulcrum of tragedy. In both cases, the means had been poison, quiet and deniable. In both, the motive had been fear of exposure, fear that a single page of truth would unravel a carefully constructed life. And in both, the guilty party had underestimated the persistence of small things. A torn corner, a stained cup, a worn glove, a dropped handkerchief. Secrets, Miss Marple reflected, were never as securely buried as their keepers believed. Like pages caught by the wind, they always surfaced eventually. She meditated on the deeper pattern. Human nature, she had long observed, was not divided neatly into good and evil. The same person who could bake bread for a neighbor or tend a sick child could, under the right pressure, pour cyanide into a teacup. Shame, greed, fear, these were universal. They wore respectable faces. The proud collector, the anxious clerk, the indebted nephew, the ashamed clergyman. Yet they all shared the same flaw, the belief that one act of concealment could preserve everything worth having. And they all discovered, too late, that the price of that act was far higher than the thing they tried to save. The book itself had undergone its own quiet redemption. Once the instrument of deception, now restored and placed on public view, it no longer hid anything. Its pages, carefully mended, told the truth plainly. In St. Mary Mead, the lost ledger had been recovered from the bottom of the churchyard well, water-stained but legible. The bank had repaid every small loan recorded in it, and the village had quietly forgiven Tom's young wife, who had known nothing. Truth, once spoken, had allowed healing. The same had happened in Netherwood. Miss Marple looked around her own small room. The fire burned steadily. The lamp cast a warm circle of light. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft, silent flakes drifting past the window, each one perfect and solitary. Yet together they would cover the world in white. She thought of the many cases she had seen, poisonings, forgeries, deceptions small and great. Each one had taught her the same lesson, that wickedness is never as clever as it believes itself to be, and that goodness, though often quiet and overlooked, is ultimately stronger. She rose, banked the fire for the night, and drew the curtains. The clock struck 10. Tomorrow she would walk to the village shop, buy a pound of sugar and a packet of tea, greet her neighbors, listen to their small troubles. Life would continue, ordinary, domestic, peaceful. She climbed the narrow stairs, the wood creaking softly under her feet. In her bedroom the quilt was turned down, the hot water bottle already warming the sheets. She set her glasses on the bedside table, blew out the candle, and settled into the familiar darkness. Outside, the snow fell on, covering the roof, the garden, the lane. In the morning the world would be new again, clean, quiet, ready for whatever small mysteries the day might bring. And somewhere, in the turning of pages and the ticking of clocks, truth would go on doing its gentle, persistent work.